Well, I did it. I killed 2 characters in the 3rd session of my Shadowdark game. That did not take very long. The situation was full of tension, it was full of drama, and it had some very difficult decisions for my players. For one player in particular. Today, I'm going to tell you everything that happened. I'm going to talk about how my players handled it both in-game and at the table, and I'll tell you a little bit about how this is going to affect our next session. This video is absolutely and guaranteed to have spoilers for Brad Kerr's The Sinister Secret of Peacock Point, which is found in his adventure anthology, Wyvern Songs. I know I said that in the last video, and it was barely kind of spoilery. I might have suggested that there could have been some adventure that occurred near maybe a lighthouse, but I promise you, this video will have actual legitimate spoilers. If you plan to play as a player in this campaign, you might want to wait and watch this video afterwards. If you're a game master, that's probably fine. If you play in my game, it's probably okay to watch. I've written the script so that it won't spoil any more of our adventure, so feel free to keep watching if you'd like. For everybody else, you have been warned. Now, before we talk about my game, let's talk a little bit about death and dying in Shadowdark. The rules for death and dying, the rules that end your character's life in Shadowdark, span just 116 words. It's all on one page, and I think it's all in one column, if I remember right. That's it. You can find all of this on page 89 of the core rulebook. Now, dying in Shadowdark is not only straightforward, it's not very hard to do. When a character goes from having hit points to not having hit points, they fall unconscious and are dying. The player rolls a 1d4 and adds their con modifier, whether it's positive, negative, or 0. This represents a timer that tells you the number of rounds before your character is dead. Like, dead. If that value is 0 or negative because you have a negative con modifier, never fear, you get a minimum of 1 round before your character dies. If your character regains hit points in any way, maybe by magical healing or by drinking a healing potion, they wake up and they are no longer dying. On their turn, a player with a dying character rolls a d20. If they roll a natural 20, the character regains 1 hit point and wakes up. A party member can also attempt to stabilize a dying ally with a DC 15 intelligence check. On success, the dying character stops dying, but they remain unconscious. Remember that DC for later. It's very high. And that's because healing a dying person or stabilizing a dying person from a potentially mortal wound is hard to do, even for a trained expert. At this point, you might imagine that I'm about to start telling you that player character deaths are awesome and that other systems are for cowards who can't handle death. But that would be patronizing and frankly untrue. What I will say is that Shadowdark is more lethal than many widely played tabletop RPGs like Dungeons & Dragons and even Pathfinder. Pathfinder's rules for death and dying are complex, but they're not unforgiving. Same thing with Dungeons & Dragons. That doesn't make Shadowdark a better or worse game, nor does it make players who like Shadowdark brave or special in any way. For a lot of players, character death is a really big deal. It's very common for players, maybe even for you, to have very strong feelings about death mechanics in the RPGs that you like to play. And I believe, with absolutely no quantitative evidence at all, that discomfort with character death is one of the largest factors in people not being willing to try Shadowdark or other old school type games. And if that's you, I am not here to tell you that you're wrong. But if you want to enjoy Shadowdark, you need to become comfortable with the idea that these death and dying rules are going to come up at your table. You need to embrace that death can come for any character at any time, and you need to plan for it. It's kind of like real life, and that got dark really fast. Better lighten the mood. We rejoin our party at Peacock Point Lighthouse, west of Oldwin Town. The party traveled here at the request of Mayor Marla Pearl to uncover why the light of the lighthouse had been snuffed out. Redley Higgs, an aging and retired wizard, had asked the party to keep an eye out for an ornate music box, a precious family heirloom that was stolen by bandits in the forest to the west of the lighthouse. Spoilers for Peacock Point start right now. It didn't take long for the party to discover that the place was infested with all manner of insect swarms. Huge earwigs, centipedes, flies, and all kinds of creepy crawlies were just scurrying over almost every surface in every room. And to make matters worse, wandering the dungeon's halls was an ancient monster known as the Skitterlord. This armless, mummy-wrapped fiend was once trapped inside the music box the old wizard claimed to have lost. It now seeks to darken the skies with its skittering children until they feast on the flesh of all humanity. Gross. The party cleared about half the dungeon, and then they decided to retreat and rest at camp. Their hireling, Aziz, had created a campfire, and the party decided to set a watch rotation. The night passed without any incident whatsoever, and in the morning they headed back into the dungeon. Now, rather than re-enter the dungeon the same way that they came out, the priest character suggested that they enter through the cave entrance that was down below the lighthouse on the beach. After some entertaining but thoroughly unnecessary discussion about high and low tides and which one it was or had to be or couldn't be, we were able to get the characters to navigate the rocky shoreline and enter the mouth of the cave that led into a wide chamber full of large rocks and, of course, darkness. The wizard lit an oil lantern and they entered the cave. Now, things would have been fine at this point had the thief not chosen to search for secret doors. It wasn't his fault, but he did search for secret doors. Behind the salt-encrusted boulders in the cave, worn smooth by the waves of higher tides, or lower ones, our thief discovered a secret passageway that led into a small bedroom. Inside, the party discovered a +1 suit of leather armor, perfectly sized for our goblin priest. Things were looking up, or at least that's how it seemed. The next room, it was time to roll a random encounter. The d6 came to a stop, one side up. The party wasn't alone. I reached for my d10. It was as if everything was happening in slow motion. As it tumbled across the blue felt of my gaming table, it came to rest with a big, round 0 staring up at me. While my friends laughed about the events of the day, I rose from my chair and collected a miniature that represented the ancient fiend, the armless one. Yes, the Skitterlord himself was to be our first encounter of the night. And for 2 of our plucky heroes, their last. Now, the Skitterlord can use swarms of insects to teleport around the map. He steps into one swarm and then shatters into 1,000 creepy crawlies and emerges within 2 miles from another swarm, allowing him to move around really, really easily. This is a really cool and on-theme way for him to appear and disappear to and from different parts of the dungeon. And in this case, he was rolled as a random encounter. So I described a swarm of insects that descended from the ceiling, coalescing into this armless, mummy-wrapped bipedal form. He performed a kick attack against the priest, which did 2 hit points worth of damage, and then his gaping maw ejected a few centipedes, just to be scary and narrative. Now, having described the Skitterlord as a bipedal, mummy-like creature, my party thought, hey, maybe this thing is undead. Technically, by the book, he's described as an ancient fiend, but the priest wanted to try to cast Turn Undead on him and see what would happen. And I figured the party was totally going to get smoked by this encounter. I mean, this is the boss. This is the big bad evil guy of this adventure. And besides, the adventure doesn't say he's not undead, so I decided I'd let it ride. Sure, the Skitterlord was undead. What's the worst that could happen? She rolled her spellcasting and succeeded. Great! Now the Skitterlord had to retreat and flee from the priest for 5 rounds. That was awesome for my first level party. Except the priest was standing in the only open doorway, the room's only revealed exit. I could have had the monster run through an unopened doorway on the other side of the room, but he was kind of penned in this corner, and so that's where he ran. And the players started plotting about how they would stack up a bunch of damage on the big baddie in case this spell had worked. So this was their chance, or so they thought. And how can I take that away from them? As the Skitterlord retreated to the corner of the room, the Seer had a successful ranged dex attack to smash a flask of lantern oil on him. Once ignited, that oil burns, doing 1d4 damage per round for 4 rounds, so this was great. So the wizard then stepped up to him and using his flint and steel, had another successful attack to spark the Skitterlord into flame. I had to make a dex check to see if the flint and steel would work under duress and he would get the spark in the right location, and everything went awesome, actually. Things were going great for the party, and I thought, this is kind of a cool way of dealing with this monster. Let's go for it. Let's see what's going to happen. The monster had to flee for 4 more rounds after this, and during each of those rounds, he was on fire. He was going to burn for those same 4 rounds. By the book, Shadowdark's Turn Undead is very, very simple. The creature has to run away for 5 rounds, and if it's low enough level and you roll high enough, it is destroyed. Unlike 5th edition, taking damage doesn't snap the creature out of being turned, but it also doesn't restrict them from taking non-movement actions. I thought about this a little bit, and I decided that the Skitterlord was probably too afraid to attack the priest or her allies while it was under the effects of Turn Undead. To me, this just felt more in the spirit of what the spell is about. However, the creature was cornered. It was wreathed in flame, it was howling in pain, and just roaring at the room. It seemed like as this scene was unfolding, it would be so thematically cool if I just had a swarm of insects come flying out of his mouth, because he can summon swarms of insects, and fill the room, some of them catching fire as they emerged. Wouldn't that be cool? Now, this wouldn't be a direct attack against the players. It was just the Skitterlord summoning some of his servants into the scene as he raged. Plus, if I combine this with his ability to swarm step into one swarm of insects and out of another, this is a way that he could retreat even further, taking him out of the fight and leaving a much weaker monster, the swarm, in his place. So that's exactly what I did. Now, of course, I still planned to reward my player's clever thinking by having him continue to burn and suffer the damage even if he was off camera. But the dice had other plans. It was at this moment that the wizard's lantern burned out. No matter, the party could see just fine by the light of the burning Skitterlord. In preparation for the game, I had printed out all of the swarm monsters in Shadowdark's book. Casually, perhaps ignorantly, I selected the Centipede Swarm as the monster for this encounter. Now, I'm going to be honest with you guys, I did not realize until I sat down to write this script that the Centipede Swarm is a level 4 monster in Shadowdark. That's a pretty tough monster for this level 1 party. I did de-level the monster's hit points. I brought them down from 4 hit dice to 3, but I failed to reduce its attack potential. Now, the Centipede Swarm has 3 attacks per round, but only with a +1 bonus. These little buggers also have a poison ability that paralyzes creatures when they fail a DC 12 con check after being bitten. At the time, I thought the +1 bonus was low enough that our party could handle it, but probably 2 attacks per round instead of 3 would have been a little bit more appropriate. Now, as I mentioned in the last video, somebody once said, "Look, kid, there's a lot going on in the world, and not all of it is your level." Maybe this was just one of those times. I rolled randomly to see which characters would be attacked by the swarm. Now, the first round, I only hit the Seer, and he became paralyzed for 4 rounds. This was actually really fun at the table because he played it off really, really well. So at this point in the combat, we're all laughing and joking about how he just suddenly stopped moving and speaking. The other players are busy pretending that their characters are confused by the sudden lack of support by the Seer. It was funny, but it didn't stay funny for very long. As the Skitterlord smoldered, the party kept stacking attacks on him and just ignoring the swarm. I think they were hoping they could drop the boss and then deal with the swarm afterwards, something that would probably have worked in 5th edition. And to their credit, they were making a lot of progress. Hoping to escape, the Skitterlord attempted to teleport by a swarm of centipedes. Now, whenever he does this, a glimmering golden scarab appears in the center of the swarm, and for a brief moment, it's hanging there in the air before it disappears. Having noticed this in a previous session, the party thief had been hatching a plan to try and catch the scarab during this transition from a corporeal being into a swarm of bugs. He dove into the swarm, and with a successful dexterity check, was able to snatch this shimmering bug. And that's when it became impossible for them to ignore the swarm. The next round, the centipedes critted the Seer and the thief, who collapsed unconscious on top of the golden scarab. With my 3rd attack, the wizard took 2 hit points of damage, reducing him to 0. All 3 characters went down in an instant. Now remember, when a character is reduced to 0 hit points, they roll a d4 and add their con modifier to determine how many rounds until they perish. This is called a death timer. Characters who are not stabilized or healed before this timer ends die. All 3 death timers resulted in a 1. Spending a luck token allows you to reroll any die roll in the game, but better or worse, you must use the new result. The Seer rerolled his death timer and got a 1 again. However, the Seer has a class feature that lets them add a d6 to any luck token rolls that they make. His d6 came up as a 2, and that gave him a total of 3 rounds until death. At this point, I began to think that the party had been through enough. The swarm began to dissipate and take less interest in the player characters. Standing there alone over the 3 dying bodies of their allies was Quarov, the goblin priest. The sounds of combat had faded, and the priest had to make a difficult decision. Who do I save? At this point, you might imagine that my players were feeling downtrodden and demoralized. After all, they nearly suffered a TPK by stumbling into the big bad evil guy of this dungeon and pushing their luck to try to slay the beast in a moment of weakness. Instead, everyone was on the edge of their seats. Now, maybe it was because it was technically possible to save everyone, but the players went into planning mode. They weighed their options. They discussed alternatives. Luckily, the priest was still alive. That meant that the party still had access to the Cure Wounds spell. Magical healing could save the party, but one failed roll while casting Cure Wounds, and that would mean that the priest didn't have access to use the spell again until they'd completed a rest. And by then, dying characters would be dead characters. The turn order went from priest to thief to seer, and then finally to wizard. While the seer had 3 rounds until death, the thief and the wizard only had 1. Now recall that Shadowdark characters can stabilize a dying character with a successful DC 15 int check to apply first aid. Think of it as putting a tourniquet on somebody. On success, a dying character is no longer dying but remains unconscious and can heal naturally. Because the wizard has higher intelligence than the thief, it might have made sense to use Cure Wounds on the wizard, because then he would have a better chance of stabilizing the other ally, maybe the thief. However, the thief's turn came before the turn of the wizard, and that meant that choosing to heal anyone other than the thief was a death sentence for him. Not only that, but doing so offered no guarantees that anyone else would be saved. A successful casting of Cure Wounds on the thief would allow him to be able to attempt to stabilize the wizard. With this plan, there was at least a small chance that the whole party would be saved. They had to try. When the priest rolled the thief character over onto his back to heal him, the golden scarab began to scurry away. The player playing the priest shot me a look. She really, and I mean really, wanted to grab the scarab. But instead, she had to watch it escape into the darkness while she called upon the power of Geed to heal the thief. The roll failed. For a moment, we were all dumbstruck. A failed roll meant Cure Wounds was off the table, and the thief was a goner. If the thief wasn't up this round, that meant the wizard was dead too. Now that's when someone at the table noticed the red poker chip that was next to her character sheet. I use poker chips at my table to represent luck tokens. It's a holdover from running games in Savage Worlds, which has a similar reroll mechanic that uses tokens as well. Giving players a physical token reminds them that they have a special resource in situations exactly like this one. Everyone at the table got excited again, and she rolled another d20. This time, Geed was with us. The thief sat up and inhaled sharply. Varks was back in the game. On his turn, he scurried over to the wizard and rolled an int check to try to stabilize the old man. The die came up a 12. At first, we thought, that's enough, right? 10? 10's good enough. But as mentioned before, you need a 15 on this roll. The wizard succumbed to his wounds and expired in the Shadowdark. On the next round, the priest rolled a critical failure when using Cure Wounds on the Seer. This removed the spell from their castable list until they could complete sacrificial penance to regain Geed's favor. It all came down to the thief's stabilization roll, which failed, dooming the Seer to death. If only they had seen this coming. Actually, he did see this coming. You see, the player playing the Seer had planned for the possibility for his character's death. He claimed that his Seer was just one in a long line of Seers that know the time and place of their death, and they also know that they are powerless to stop it. Knowing his Seer was about to die, his replacement had been journeying to this location to take up the mantle and to become the next Seer of... Honestly, I have no idea. I should probably ask him. Or perhaps it's best left mysterious, because that gives us more flexibility in the future, the less we chisel into stone now. Of course, if the replacement Seer knew his predecessor was doomed to die, it's not a huge leap to imagine that he would have known that the wizard was going to die in that same time, or that same encounter. So we smash cut to a small fishing village. It's a half-mile down the beach from Peacock Point. 2 men in robes disembark a boat at the pier. One of them says to the other, "We must hurry. Arcadia is about to fall." The thief and the cleric are looting the bodies of their fallen comrades because that's what you do when they hear footsteps approaching outside. The 2 of them hide in an adjacent room from a guy who can see the future. Kinda. I have no idea if this is interesting to watch. We're not really talking about Shadowdark anymore. At this point, I feel like I'm just telling you about my campaign, which could be super lame, but I figure if you thought it was lame, you would have already clicked away by now. So if you're still here, I'm glad you've enjoyed the video up to this point. The important thing is, we knew Shadowdark was dangerous when we sat down to play. And the danger produced one of the most intense sequences of die rolls that I've seen at our table in a good long while. In fact, in all the excitement, we forgot to let our downed players roll on their turn, hoping for that natural 20 that would give them a hit point and allow them to sit back up, regaining consciousness. There was just so much focus on the cleric and the thief's actions and the die rolls that we just totally missed this opportunity. When I pointed this out to the players later, everyone was totally satisfied with the narrative and the direction that the story took, as well as with their new characters. So we decided to just let the dice lie as they fell. I don't know if there's a point to this story, really. It tells you a little bit about our experience with our first deaths in Shadowdark. I suppose for me, this was kind of a big moment because our table survived those first deaths, and at least for us, it was fun and intense and exciting and tragic. Many tabletop RPG players would not have enjoyed this sequence of events. That's okay. Character death is not fun for everyone. I think that some players think the higher potential for death in old school games, like Shadowdark, prevents satisfying stories from developing at the table. But at least so far, I disagree. It's true that old school gaming might not really be about intricate, complicated, interwoven storylines where your band of superheroes is trying to save the world from some godlike evildoer. But when a party loses a character, that event is experienced by the characters in that party. The death of a character is not the end of the story. Often, it's a catalyst for more adventure. It raises the stakes. It's heartbreaking. Losing a beloved character can make us angry. It can feel cheap or unnecessary. If you lose a character, let it be a problem. Let it motivate the survivors. Let it fuel the party's eventual triumph. Not every death is going to be impactful, and none of them need to be. That's up to you. I'm not telling you to stop and have a funeral every time your hireling's hireling dies, but if you lose a cool character in Shadowdark, it can mean something if you want it to. Thanks for watching.